The truth doesn't care who gets blamed. It only cares who moved the dirt. The first thing I remember wasn't the sound of rain. It was the deep metallic groan of storm drains giving up after decades of doing exactly what they were built to do. Then came the smell. Wet clay, diesel fuel, fresh-cut grass, and something sharp in the air that only appears when a river decides it has found a new path. I stood on my front porch before sunrise watching muddy water race across perfectly manicured lawns that had looked like golf courses just 24 hours earlier. Luxury SUVs sat half-submerged in driveways. Patio furniture drifted through intersections. Mailboxes leaned at impossible angles as if they were trying to escape with everyone else. Sirens echoed from every direction, bouncing between oversized homes that suddenly looked a lot smaller against the power of moving water. My phone vibrated so hard it nearly slipped out of my hand. One notification after another. Neighbors posting videos. Local news helicopters circling overhead. Hundreds of comments already naming the person responsible before anyone knew what had actually happened. My name. By 8 o'clock that morning, the president of our homeowners association stood in front of television cameras wearing an expensive raincoat that somehow stayed perfectly clean while the neighborhood around her disappeared beneath 2 feet of muddy floodwater. Patricia Whitmore pointed across the street without even looking at me. "This disaster could have been prevented," she said with complete confidence. One homeowner ignored repeated concerns about the river beside his property. I could actually hear my own heartbeat over the generators humming nearby. The strange part was that every word she said sounded believable if you didn't know the facts. I was the engineer who lived closest to the river. I had questioned the HOA's landscaping project for months. I had sent emails warning them that something about their construction didn't make sense. Now those same warnings were being twisted into evidence against me. 3 days later, a courier knocked on my door while crews were still pumping water out of flooded garages. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Inside was a lawsuit demanding $2.8 million for property damage, emergency response costs, and alleged negligence involving the river that flooded the subdivision. I read the first page twice before one sentence stopped me cold. They claimed I had failed to properly maintain the river bordering my property. I laughed out loud. Not because anything was funny, but because it was so unbelievably wrong. I didn't own that river. I never had. I couldn't legally alter it even if I wanted to. Federal maps, county records, and decades of public infrastructure documents all said exactly the same thing. The river belonged to the county watershed authority. Yet somehow I had become the villain in a disaster I had spent months trying to prevent. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer, and I've spent my career studying how water behaves when people think they can outsmart it. What Patricia Whitmore didn't understand was that rivers don't lie. Concrete leaves fingerprints, and every shovelful of dirt tells a story if you know where to look. She thought she had found the perfect man to blame. She had no idea she had just handed me the evidence that would expose everything. 8 months before anyone blamed me for anything, the loudest sound outside my house was the gentle rush of water moving around smooth limestone along the riverbank every evening just before sunset. That was exactly why I bought the place. After 15 years designing drainage systems, retention basins, and flood control projects across Texas, I had grown tired of cities where every square foot of land was treated like another opportunity to pour concrete. I wanted somewhere quieter, somewhere I could drink my coffee on a back porch and hear birds instead of traffic. The house itself was nothing extravagant. A modest 2-story home sitting on just under 3 acres outside the subdivision boundary, separated from the neighborhood by a narrow strip of county-owned land and the river beyond it. Most people assumed the water belonged to whoever lived closest to it. That assumption would eventually become the foundation of the biggest lie anyone had ever told about me. Every morning started the same way. Fresh coffee, cool air carrying the scent of cedar and damp earth, then a slow walk toward the fence overlooking the floodplain. Engineers develop strange habits. While other people admired the sunrise, I noticed culvert sizes, erosion patterns, sediment deposits, and watermarks left on rocks after heavy rain. You stop seeing scenery and start seeing systems. Water always leaves clues if you are patient enough to notice them. My neighbors thought I was overly cautious because I kept measuring rainfall and photographing the river after storms. They laughed when they saw small measuring stakes near the bank. A retired couple across the road joked that I probably gave weather reports to fish. I laughed with them because explaining hydrology during a neighborhood conversation rarely makes new friends. Then Patricia Whitmore arrived as the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association. She drove a spotless white luxury sport utility vehicle that somehow never seemed to collect dust despite constantly touring the neighborhood. Her smile looked polished enough for campaign posters, and she had a remarkable talent for making demands sound like generous favors. During her first community meeting, she spoke endlessly about increasing property values, improving curb appeal, and transforming the neighborhood into the premier riverfront destination in the county. The audience applauded nearly every sentence. I noticed something different. Every glossy rendering displayed wider green spaces, decorative stone walls, walking trails, and ornamental landscaping sitting remarkably close to areas that county flood maps clearly identified as drainage corridors. After the meeting, I introduced myself and quietly mentioned that those sections occasionally carried stormwater during major rainfall events. She smiled without blinking and thanked me for my professional opinion before immediately changing the subject to flower beds and bicycle paths. That conversation stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the following weeks, I started noticing orange survey flags appearing near the river, followed by utility paint, wooden stakes, and eventually construction equipment parked beside areas that had remained untouched for decades. The smell of fresh diesel drifted through my open windows before sunrise, and the steady beeping of reversing loaders replaced the peaceful sound of flowing water. Every instinct developed over my career told me something was wrong, although I could not yet explain exactly what they were building or why no public notices had appeared anywhere in the county records I regularly reviewed for work. The river kept flowing exactly as it always had, but the land surrounding it was beginning to change in ways that made me increasingly uneasy. Within 2 weeks, the construction crews became part of the neighborhood soundtrack. Diesel engines started before daylight, backup alarms echoed across the open fields, and the sharp smell of fresh asphalt drifted through my kitchen windows long before I poured my first cup of coffee. Patricia called the entire project Riverfront Enhancement Initiative, a name polished enough to make almost everyone believe it was a gift to the community. Decorative stone walls appeared where native grass had protected the bank for decades. Truck after truck dumped compacted fill into shallow drainage swales that had quietly carried stormwater long before any of these houses existed. New walking paths curved closer to the river, and ornamental trees replaced thick patches of vegetation that had naturally slowed runoff every rainy season. Every improvement looked beautiful if you judged it with your eyes instead of engineering plans. I drove past the work site every evening after work and noticed details that most people never would. Fresh tire tracks crossing the floodplain. Survey stakes positioned several feet inside what county maps identified as drainage easements. Concrete edging that interrupted natural flow channels. None of those changes seemed dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern that made the back of my neck tighten. Water does not negotiate with landscaping. It follows physics, not marketing brochures. One Saturday morning, I walked over while a crew was installing large decorative boulders beside the riverbank. The foreman was friendly enough. He wiped concrete dust from his gloves and told me they were simply following the approved site drawings provided by the Homeowners Association. When I asked whether they had completed a hydraulic impact study before modifying the drainage corridor, he frowned for a second before admitting he had never seen one. He pointed me toward Patricia instead. That afternoon, I knocked on the clubhouse office door carrying nothing more threatening than a notebook filled with measurements and photographs. Patricia welcomed me with the same polished smile she wore at every community meeting. I calmly explained that filling even a portion of those drainage channels could redirect stormwater during a major rainfall event. I showed her county floodplain maps printed directly from public records. I even highlighted the sections indicating that those low areas existed specifically to keep neighborhoods from flooding. She barely glanced at the pages before sliding them back across the table. According to her, the project had been reviewed by experienced consultants and would increase property values without creating any risk. She thanked me for my concern in the same tone people use when dismissing an overly cautious relative. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know. She was not interested in evidence. She was interested in confidence. Over the following month, I sent 3 polite electronic mail messages summarizing my observations and attaching publicly available maps so there would be a written record of my concerns. I never accused anyone of wrongdoing. I simply recommended an independent drainage review before construction continued. The only response I received was a brief message stating that the project remained fully on schedule and that unnecessary speculation could create confusion among residents. Meanwhile, the stone walls grew longer, the drainage channels became narrower, and every afternoon the steady rumble of heavy equipment drowned out the quiet sound of the river that had first convinced me this place was worth calling home. By late spring, the neighborhood looked exactly the way Patricia had promised. Fresh stone pathways curved beside the river, newly planted trees lined the walking trails, and the carefully sculpted landscaping filled every community newsletter with glowing photographs. Visitors admired the improvements. Realtors proudly described the subdivision as an exclusive riverfront community where nature and luxury existed in perfect balance. I was apparently the only person who noticed that every heavy rain left small warning signs behind. Thin lines of mud appeared where water had begun searching for its old routes. Fresh sediment collected against decorative retaining walls that had never been designed to hold moving floodwater. The new grass looked beautiful until you realized it covered drainage channels that no longer existed. One evening I stood at my fence after a brief thunderstorm, watching rainwater hesitate for just a second before spreading sideways instead of continuing toward the river. That tiny delay lasted only moments before the water finally squeezed through a much narrower opening. Most people would never have noticed it. To me, it felt like hearing a small crack inside the foundation of a building. Nothing had failed yet, but something was under pressure. A few days later, the weather forecast caught my attention. A large storm system was moving slowly across central Texas, bringing several inches of rain over less than 48 hours. Heavy rainfall was nothing unusual for this region. Good drainage systems were designed for events exactly like this. I checked the county rainfall projections, compared them with floodplain data, and walked the property one last time. The air felt strangely heavy, carrying the smell of wet cedar before the first drop had even fallen. The river flowed calmly, almost peacefully, as though it had no intention of reminding everyone how much power it actually held. I sent one final electronic mail message to the Homeowners Association recommending temporary inspections of the modified drainage areas before the storm arrived. The response came back less than an hour later. Patricia thanked me once again for my concern and assured me their contractors had everything completely under control. That sentence stayed in my mind as dark clouds slowly erased the afternoon sunlight. Rain began just after dinner, soft enough that it barely interrupted the sound of crickets. By midnight, it had become a steady roar against the roof. I barely slept. Years of working around flood control projects had trained me to recognize the rhythm of storms. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight. Cool wind pushed sheets of rain across the yard, while the familiar scent of damp soil mixed with fresh clay. The river had risen several feet, but still remained inside its banks. That was the surprising part. The danger was not coming from the river itself. It was coming from everything around it. Water poured across streets faster than storm drains could collect it. Instead of flowing naturally toward the open floodplain, it began backing into landscaped areas where the drainage channels had been narrowed by stone walls and decorative fill. I watched shallow pools connect into larger streams, then into fast-moving sheets of muddy water sliding directly toward the subdivision. Before sunrise, emergency vehicle lights reflected across the growing water like flashes of red and blue on broken glass. Standing there in the cold rain, I realized the river had done exactly what it had always done. It was the neighborhood that had changed, and now the entire system was beginning to reveal the price of pretending that engineering could be replaced by landscaping. By sunrise, the rain had finally eased, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm itself. The familiar sound of birds had been replaced by water pumps, emergency generators, and the distant rumble of tow trucks pulling stranded vehicles from flooded streets. The neighborhood looked like it had aged 10 years overnight. Fresh mulch covered sidewalks in thick brown streaks. Decorative flower beds had become shallow ponds. Expensive stone walls stood exactly where they had been built, quietly trapping muddy water that should have drained away hours earlier. I pulled on my boots and walked toward the Entrance of the subdivision. Careful to stay clear of emergency crews already inspecting damaged intersections. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence confirming exactly what I had feared for months. Watermarks climbed garage doors several feet high, yet the river itself had already dropped back inside its natural channel. That detail mattered. Rivers that cause flooding usually leave obvious scars along their banks. This one had remained remarkably predictable. The water that devastated the neighborhood had come from trapped runoff with nowhere left to go. I barely made it halfway down the main boulevard before someone shouted my name. A small group of homeowners stood outside the clubhouse, staring at me with expressions that shifted between frustration and disbelief. Before I could say a word, Patricia stepped forward holding a stack of printed papers protected inside a clear plastic folder. Even after the longest night the neighborhood had ever experienced, her clothes looked perfectly pressed. Her voice carried across the parking lot with practiced confidence as she announced that several residents had already reported seeing me photographing the drainage areas before the storm. She suggested that I had known exactly what was going to happen and had done nothing to stop it. The accusation spread through the crowd faster than the floodwater ever had. I tried explaining that my photographs documented conditions I had repeatedly warned the association about months earlier. I reminded everyone about the electronic mail messages, the floodplain maps, and the conversations regarding the narrow drainage corridors. Patricia simply smiled and held up a single page from one of my earlier messages. She read only one sentence aloud, the line where I had written that severe flooding could occur if construction continued without an independent review. She stopped reading before the part where I recommended preventing the problem entirely. Suddenly my warning sounded like an admission instead of an attempt to help. Cameras from 2 local news stations arrived before noon. Reporters interviewed frustrated homeowners standing beside soaked furniture and ruined landscaping. While Patricia described me as the engineer who had repeatedly interfered with community improvements, nobody asked to see the complete correspondence. Nobody questioned why someone would carefully document a problem months in advance if he intended to cause it. By late afternoon, my telephone would not stop ringing. Friends from work wanted to know why my face was appearing on television. Clients politely postponed meetings until the situation became clearer. Then, just as the sun finally broke through the clouds, another certified envelope arrived at my front door. This one contained formal notice that the Homeowners Association intended to pursue full financial recovery against me for millions of dollars in damages. Standing there with wet boots on drying concrete, I realized I was no longer fighting public opinion alone. I was about to face an organized legal campaign built on selective facts, polished presentations, and one enormous lie that almost everyone seemed willing to believe. The first lawyer I met spent less than 15 minutes reviewing the lawsuit before leaning back in his chair with a long sigh that told me more than his words ever could. He admitted the facts sounded unusual, but he also warned me that lawsuits are often won by the story people believe before they ever see the evidence. At that moment, the Homeowners Association had television interviews, emotional homeowners, photographs of flooded streets, and a confident president repeating the same narrative every day. All I had were engineering concerns buried inside electronic mail messages that most people had never read. I left his office carrying the same thick folder I had brought in, except now it felt twice as heavy. Instead of driving home, I turned toward the county records building. It was an old brick structure that smelled faintly of aging paper, floor polish, and dust that had settled into every shelf over decades. Most people only visited when buying property or researching family history. Engineers came for different reasons. We came looking for the quiet details hidden inside public records that nobody else bothered to read. I requested every document connected to the drainage corridor beside the subdivision, including easement records, original grading plans, floodplain studies, maintenance agreements, permit applications, and archived engineering drawings. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she saw the list, then disappeared into the storage area for nearly an hour. When she returned, she placed several thick archive boxes on the table with a tired smile that suggested I would be there for the rest of the day. She was right. Hour after hour, I worked through faded blueprints, inspection reports, handwritten survey notes, and decades of county correspondence. The soft hum of fluorescent lights blended with the quiet turning of paper while the outside world slowly disappeared. Then I found the first piece that made my pulse quicken. Buried inside a drainage improvement file from more than 30 years earlier was an official floodplain map showing a wide overflow corridor running directly through the area where the Homeowners Association had recently installed decorative landscaping. That alone was significant, but the next document changed everything. It was an easement agreement permanently reserving those low areas for stormwater conveyance under county authority. No private organization had legal authority to obstruct or modify them without formal approval. I kept digging. A permit index showed routine maintenance performed over the years, but there was no record of any application authorizing the recent grading work, stone retaining walls, or imported fill that had transformed the drainage channels. My hands actually stopped moving for a moment as the pattern became impossible to ignore. The Homeowners Association had not simply improved landscaping. They had quietly altered protected stormwater infrastructure without the documentation that every legitimate construction project requires. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant record and organized them in chronological order across my dining room table that evening. Looking at the stack under the warm light above the table, I finally understood why Patricia had been so eager to blame me before anyone started asking technical questions. If investigators followed the paperwork instead of the headlines, they would eventually discover that the flood had not begun with the river at all. It had begun with decisions made long before the first raindrop ever touched the ground. The next morning, I stopped thinking like a defendant and started thinking like an engineer again. Opinions had put me in this situation, but measurements were going to get me out of it. I contacted 3 people I trusted professionally, not because they were friends, but because they had built careers on facts that could survive courtroom scrutiny. The first was a licensed land surveyor who had spent 25 years mapping property boundaries and drainage easements across the county. The second specialized in aerial mapping using drones equipped with high-resolution cameras capable of producing precise elevation models. The third was a hydraulic modeling consultant I had worked with on several municipal flood control projects. None of them cared about neighborhood politics. They cared about numbers. Within 48 hours, we were standing along the edge of the flooded corridor, while the air still carried the smell of damp soil and freshly exposed clay. The survey crew carefully located every property corner, easement marker, retaining wall, and drainage swale using professional-grade global positioning system equipment. Every measurement was logged, photographed, and time-stamped. Meanwhile, the drone climbed silently above the neighborhood, capturing hundreds of overlapping images that would later be stitched into an accurate 3-dimensional terrain model. Looking at the live monitor, the altered landscape became impossible to ignore. The decorative berms, imported fill, and stone walls created invisible barriers that redirected runoff away from its historic flow path and back toward the homes Patricia claimed had been victims of an unpredictable disaster. The hydraulic consultant took rainfall records directly from the National Weather Service and combined them with county topographic data that predated the landscaping project. He then compared those records against the new survey. Hours later, sitting around my dining room table surrounded by maps, laptops, and stacks of engineering reports, we watched the first simulation. Blue lines representing stormwater followed the original drainage channels exactly as decades of county planning had intended. Then we activated the modified terrain. The difference appeared almost immediately. Water slowed where fill had been placed. It backed against decorative walls. It spilled sideways into residential streets before the river itself even reached bank-full conditions. Nobody in the room said a word for several seconds. The computer animation simply confirmed what experience had already suggested. The flood had been engineered, not by nature, but by choices made during construction. I continued gathering every piece of supporting evidence I could legally obtain. Security camera footage from nearby homeowners showed dump trucks delivering fill into low areas weeks before the storm. Public meeting minutes proudly described expanding green space closer to the river. Archived promotional photographs posted on the Homeowners Association website accidentally documented construction progress month by month. Even social media posts celebrating the new walking paths revealed equipment operating inside protected drainage corridors. Piece by piece, the story Patricia had built for television began collapsing under the weight of her own records. My attorney smiled for the first time since accepting the case. He spread the evidence across the conference table, and quietly said something I will never forget. Jurors may argue about opinions all day long, but they rarely argue with mathematics that can be demonstrated one frame at a time. At that moment, I realized we were no longer preparing a defense. We were preparing to let the water tell its own story, and unlike the headlines, the water had documented every single mistake with perfect honesty. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. After weeks of television interviews, neighborhood meetings, and endless speculation, the room where everything actually mattered felt almost peaceful. The faint smell of polished wood mixed with fresh coffee from the hallway, while stacks of binders covered both counsel tables. Patricia sat confidently beside the Homeowners Association attorneys, occasionally glancing toward me with the same practiced smile she had worn since the flood. She still believed the story she had created was stronger than the evidence I had collected. My attorney stood first. Instead of beginning with emotional testimony or dramatic accusations, he dimmed the lights and displayed a county floodplain map that had existed long before a single house in the subdivision had been built. The judge leaned forward as each drainage easement appeared on the large screen. Next came the certified survey showing where the decorative walls, imported fill, and landscape berms had been installed. Every line matched the official county records exactly. Then the aerial drone model appeared. The three-dimensional image rotated slowly above the courtroom, revealing elevations that could never be appreciated from ground level. For the first time, everyone could clearly see how the newly constructed landscaping interrupted the natural drainage corridor. My hydraulic consultant calmly explained each step of the computer simulation using rainfall data collected by the National Weather Service. First, he displayed the terrain exactly as it had existed before construction. Blue water flowed naturally through the protected channels and reached the river without threatening nearby homes. Then he activated the updated terrain using the post-construction survey. Within seconds, the animation showed runoff backing against the decorative improvements before spreading into residential streets. The river itself remained inside its banks while stormwater, trapped by the altered landscape, flooded the neighborhood. The room became noticeably quieter with every passing minute. Patricia's attorneys attempted to argue that my engineering opinions were merely one interpretation of complex events. My attorney responded by introducing certified county records, permit histories, and maintenance files confirming that no authorization had ever been issued to obstruct those protected drainage easements. The judge paused the proceedings long enough to review the documents personally. When questioning resumed, one simple question changed everything. He asked the Homeowners Association to identify the permit approving construction inside the county drainage corridor. Their legal team searched through folders, whispered among themselves, and finally admitted they could not produce one. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer than the entire trial. The judge then turned toward me and asked a question I had been waiting to answer since the day the lawsuit arrived. Mr. Walker, do you own or control this river in any legal capacity? I answered with a single word. No. Certified property records immediately appeared on the courtroom screen, confirming exactly that. The river belonged to the County Watershed Authority, just as it always had. The Homeowners Association had built its entire lawsuit around an ownership claim that never existed. More importantly, the evidence demonstrated that the flooding resulted from unauthorized modifications to public drainage infrastructure rather than any action on my part. By the time closing arguments ended, the confidence Patricia had carried into the courtroom had quietly disappeared. She no longer looked at me. She kept staring at the same engineering drawings she had dismissed months earlier, as though hoping they might suddenly begin telling a different story. They never did. The judge returned with a written ruling 3 weeks later, and the courtroom felt completely different from the day the lawsuit had begun. There were no television cameras waiting for dramatic statements, and no confident speeches about easy answers. There were only facts arranged in neat stacks across polished wooden tables. The decision was clear. Every claim against me was dismissed because the evidence demonstrated that I neither owned, controlled, nor maintained the river the Homeowners Association had blamed for the flooding. The ruling went further than I expected. It specifically referenced the certified county records, the drainage easements, the survey data, and the hydraulic modeling that established how unauthorized alterations had redirected stormwater into the subdivision. The judge also ordered that the Complete record be forwarded to the appropriate county agencies responsible for reviewing construction activity inside protected drainage corridors. I did not celebrate inside the courtroom. I simply packed my binders, shook my attorney's hand, and walked outside into warm afternoon sunshine that felt strangely peaceful after months of constant pressure. Over the following weeks, the story changed in ways no public relations campaign could stop. County inspectors arrived with measuring equipment that looked remarkably similar to the survey tools we had used months earlier. Engineers reviewed drainage plans, compared historical records with current site conditions, and documented every modification that had taken place inside the protected corridor. Residents gradually learned that the documents I had tried to share before the storm had been accurate from the beginning. Several neighbors who had avoided me for months quietly stopped by my house. Some apologized for believing the headlines before looking at the evidence. Others simply admitted they had never realized how complicated stormwater engineering could be until they watched it explained in court. I accepted every conversation without resentment because fear often convinces good people to believe the loudest voice instead of the most careful one. Patricia resigned from the Homeowners Association board before the end of the season. New leadership announced plans to cooperate fully with county engineers and restore the drainage corridor according to approved public standards. Heavy equipment returned once again, but this time the sound of excavators removing imported fill carried a very different meaning. Decorative walls disappeared, blocked channels were reopened, and native vegetation slowly returned to places where water had always needed room to move. The first major storm after the restoration arrived almost a year later. I stood on the same porch where I had watched muddy water spread across the neighborhood before. Rain fell steadily through the evening, while the familiar scent of wet cedar drifted across the property. This time the runoff entered the restored drainage corridor, followed its natural path, and reached the river exactly as the original engineering drawings intended decades earlier. By sunrise the streets were wet, but they were clear. The homes were dry, and the only sound outside was the quiet current moving over limestone beneath the morning light. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and watched the river continue downstream without asking for credit or defending its reputation. That morning reminded me of something every engineer eventually learns. Water never lies. It simply follows the path people leave behind for it. The truth works much the same way. You can delay it, redirect it, or try to blame someone else for a while, but sooner or later it always finds its proper course. And when it does, justice does not arrive with the loudest voice. It arrives one documented fact at a time.